Just once again, my name's Sarah Piers. I work in programming with the Natural Areas Association, and I'm just pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Natural Areas Association. We are a member-supported nonprofit organization. We're over 40 years old, and we provide networking, training, and advocacy for natural areas professionals, including you. We support your work in conservation and natural areas management by bringing you the latest science and best practices through the Natural Areas Journal, which is a peer-reviewed quarterly publication. We also host regional workshops and an annual Natural Areas Conference. And then a very important part of our programming right now is our webinars, including this one. I encourage you to visit naturalareas.org or connect with a colleague who's a member of the NAA to learn more about what we do and how we can support your work. We have several upcoming events, especially webinars. We'll have a webinar on June 16th about fireflies and how to protect them in the context of natural areas management. And then also another webinar on the 23rd of June, again with the Institute for Applied Ecology. They have some creative approaches to share about working with prison populations to grow native plants for ecological restoration. So we look forward to that webinar. Please check our website for a full list of upcoming webinars, registration, abstracts, speaker bios, and recordings of past webinars, including last week's webinar on the efficacy of using goats to control invasive species. We also have our conference. We are hosting our annual conference this year. It's our 47th national conference. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the conference will be in a virtual format, not an in-person meeting. Please stay in touch with us by checking our website for updates and joining our mailing list to learn more about our plans. And now I'll hand it over to our Executive Director, Lisa Smith.
Hi, everybody. This webinar today is part of a series of webinars that we've been offering this year that are focused on the importance of native seed in natural areas management. We've either hosted or are going to host a total of 5 of these in 2020, and they're made possible and free to you through the generous underwriting of our partners at the Bureau of Land Management Plant Conservation and Restoration Program, as well as the in-kind support of our partners like the Institute for Applied Ecology. We're fortunate here at NAA to be able to work with several partners to make webinars like this one today free of charge to you. But as you might imagine, not all are underwritten. And so this work, so we'd like to encourage those of you who find this type of programming of value to think about becoming members of NAA if you're not one already. It's one of the ways that you can support us so that we're able to continue to offer this type of valuable resource for you. Times are changing for all of us, and while NAA plans to not waver from offering important information and support to our community, we are faced with the challenges of funding this work. So I think you will see in the near future that a membership in NAA will bring with it even more benefit for those of you working in natural areas conservation, excuse me. And thanks to those of you that are already members, we look forward to continuing to serve you. So with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter today. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Tom Kaye. Tom is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Applied Ecology, a nonprofit organization with a mission to conserve native habitats and species through research, restoration, and education. Sourcing native plants for restoration is a key interest, research, and area of interest, research, and publication for Tom. He also conducts research on rare species reintroductions, habitat restoration, plant invasions, and plant population responses to climate change. So Tom, I'll let you take it from here. If you go ahead and share your screen.
Great, thank you very much. Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Sarah, for the invitation to present here today on the topic of diversity is magic, emerging issues in selecting appropriate native plants for ecosystem restoration. I'm Tom Kaye. I'm the director of the Institute for Applied Ecology. We're based in Corvallis, Oregon, as well as Santa Fe, New Mexico. And our mission is to conserve native species and habitats through restoration, research, and education. We're very active in each of those areas, and it's my pleasure to share with you some of the work we do and to summarize the work of many others here today. The Earth is our only planet, and we are seeing substantial changes occurring, even on a daily basis, it seems, with global warming, invasive species, pandemics, etc. Things are changing under our feet, literally, and over our heads. This is causing an urgent need to do something about it. It's also causing a sense of pain, of environmental grief among many people. There's even a term for this, solastalgia, in which we feel grief, we feel sadness and loss for what's going on to our planet. What is good, the good news is we know there are things we can do, and restoration through seed-based habitat restoration is one of the steps we can take. Now, this problem is dire. Hobbs published this map a few years ago. The top one shows the extent of the human footprint on Earth. And you can see those areas in red are extreme human impacts, where the density of people has just increased to the point where natural systems are extremely or completely altered. So the top map here shows the impact of the human footprint on Earth and its biomes. And as of 2008, the urban population exceeded the rural population for the first time. And because those urban populations are in areas that are expanding, the footprint of humans on Earth is becoming quite substantial. It's resulting in the loss of species. Over 1,300 species are near threatened or extinct, according to the IUCN Red List. That's 4% of the world plant species as we know them now. In the United States, that translates into about 939 threatened and endangered species, 5% of which are, that's 5% of our flora. And interestingly, in the US, 20% of the plants in our flora are non-native. So you can see there's this tide of non-native species sweeping across our vegetation. And that is causing, at least one of the effects is the loss of some of the biological diversity in our landscapes. Diversity is in decline in part because of climate change. In an interesting paper a few years ago, Damshin, Harrison, and Grace found that in the Siskiyou Mountains of Southern Oregon and Northern California, where Robert Whitaker, an eminent ecologist from Cornell in the mid-1900s, put in a bunch of plots and recorded the number of species in each plot and other things about the habitats. And these guys went back and revisited those same plots many years later, and they found that species richness, species diversity had declined very substantially without dramatic changes in land use, which pointed the finger at climate change as one of the big drivers of this loss of diversity. And so that brings us to the topic of seeds. And so today, what I'd like to talk to you about is, this is my thesis, that plant diversity is responsible for ecosystem service. Ecosystem service is our goal in restoration. And diversity is that element that really adds ecosystem service beyond just any particular vegetation type. And seeds are the key to restoring that diversity. That's my message to you today. And here's how I'm going to approach it. Well, first off, that's right. We have a poll. We have a couple of poll questions for you today. And Sarah is going to show the poll for you right now.
So the poll question is, how important is increasing plant diversity as part of habitat restoration to you? Not important, somewhat important, moderately important, very important, extremely important. And at this point, we're looking at about 63% of people are saying that it's extremely important. So continue to participate in the poll. I'll give you several more minutes or several more seconds here to enter your answers before we close the poll. It looks like most of the answers are either very important or extremely important. So I've stopped the poll and now I will share those results.
Well, hopefully everybody can see those results. The question was, how important is increasing plant diversity as part of habitat restoration to you? Nobody answered not important. And the majority answered extremely important or very important. So we're on the same page. I don't have to convince you necessarily, although I'm going to continue to make an effort to make this case and make this point. So I'm going to structure this talk like this. First, I'm going to talk about the importance of diversity for ecosystem function. And then about the importance of native species over weeds. It's not just any diversity. I'll review some of the tools for increasing diversity, especially in grassland habitats. Focus on some current and emerging issues in seed selection, and review some online seed selection tools for you. So first, the importance of diversity for ecosystem function. So really, diversity has been framed before as the spice of life, and I believe that is truer than the coiner of that phrase even knew. I'm going to review for you a couple of big experiments that have looked at the effects of diversity. One is here at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve Center in Minnesota, and researchers at this location have developed this large-scale gridded plot system. This is kind of like a super collider for a physicist. This is the kind of experiment that ecologists get really excited about because it's large scale and allows us to control and manipulate a number of variables. So these guys looked at the effects of diversity on ecosystem function. And this was the experiment that really led to Dave Tillman's paper in Nature on the diversity stability hypothesis. And that is that as diversity increases, this, if you can see my mouse on the x-axis, as diversity increases, so does ecosystem stability. And that means the ability of the ecosystem to produce primary productivity in the same amount from year to year without a lot of variability. And variability can be very bad for ecosystems because stochasticity can lead to extinction and degradation of environments. So keeping productivity stable is a very important thing for ecosystem function. Here's another similar kind of experiment in Jena, Germany, which also looked at the effects of diversity on ecosystem function. And these folks published a nice set of review papers, and I'm going to look at one of them here with you, where they manipulated diversity in plots and then measured attributes, many different attributes of the environment or the ecosystem. And so one thing they found was that plant diversity is really at the center of controlling a lot of different organisms and their abundance and diversity. So above ground, there's herbivores, there's plant biomass, parasitoids, carnivores, omnivores, blah, 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 everything's affected. And below ground, same too, the herbivorous macrofauna, the predatory macrofauna, the saprophytic macrofauna, all these organisms are responding to the diversity of plants themselves. And you can look at that graphically up here in this figure, and note that in the top half of these panels is above ground, and the below half is below ground. The left half is abundance, and the right half is species richness. And for simplicity, I'll just call your attention to the upper right one. And note that the response of all these different kinds of organisms to increasing plant species richness is positive. Everything's responding positively in their diversity, with one exception, and that's invasive species. Invasive species are declining as native species diversity increases. That's an important note to take away from this. So diversity begets diversity. The more diversity of plants we have, the more diversity of other organisms. But why native diversity? Why should we care about whether it's native or a weed or whatever? You know, species are just species and they're all adding something, right? Well, one of the reasons to focus on natives is that simply put, when weeds are dominant in the landscape, it's the same damn weeds from place to place. So beta diversity goes down. And so this figure right here on the top right shows that as native richness increases, exotic cover is going down. Or put it opposite, if we transpose this figure, as exotic diversity increases, native richness declines. So that's on a plot by plot basis, and this is true at the plot or the block or the site level. This is at multiple scales. And then also when we look at turnover or beta diversity, we see the same pattern, that as we go from place to place, the number of exotics doesn't turn over very much. It's the same weeds from location to location, but the number of natives does turn over substantially. So having a lot of weeds on the landscape erodes the heterogeneity in the landscape, which is also has a negative effect on many organisms, especially motile organisms like birds, where this has been demonstrated that when you have a weedy environment and there's low species turnover in plants, you have lower bird diversity as well. So how do we restore diversity? Well, really the answer is simple: with seeds. And seeding may be the only way to increase diversity in some systems, certainly at large scales. And in part because of this, the federal government, through its Plant Conservation Alliance of 12 different federal agencies, produced the National Seed Strategy a few years ago to help us assess the availability of native seeds in the US for restoration, to identify the scientific questions we need to explore to get better at this, and to learn different techniques and share different techniques of sharing, getting the word out about how important native seeds are for habitat restoration. So one of the kind of core importances of using seeds is because most ecosystems are seed limited, and there are some exceptions where you just kill all the weeds and the natives just come out of the soil, but in most cases that's just not true. It won't work that way. So unfortunately, we have to put seeds back once we've killed off the weeds. And this experiment here by Seabloom and others showed that even next to a dense patch of a plant where the habitat appeared beneficial, adding seeds more than doubled the number of seedlings that came up naturally from natural seed rain. And then as you moved away from the patch, this was still true. You got few plants came up without seeding, and more did when you did seed. So these are seed limited habitats in some cases. So, and adding seeds adds diversity. Adding seeds gets plants to establish, but adding more species adds diversity. And here's some results of an experiment that we were involved in several years ago at a place called Coyote Creek in the West Eugene wetlands area in Western Oregon. And we were looking at ways to improve plant diversity in restored wetlands. And you can see in the center of this image, this gridded area. So this was our answer to a large-scale ecological experiment. It's just smaller than those other big ones I talked about earlier. This is what it looked like from the air. These were 15 by 15 meter plots, mowed between them, and all seeded with native species. And then what we did was, after a restoration had occurred, we went back and tried different techniques to improve the species diversity. So we use burning, mowing, haying, grazing as techniques to improve diversity, but we also did seeding on top of these treatments, and we did seeding at different diversity rates from 4 different levels, from 0 to a high seeding rate. And what we found was that species richness could respond to these different treatments, but really only when seed addition was carried out. So seed addition generally resulted in more species being present, but only in the case of burning did seed addition reliably result in higher species diversity. And the more species we added, the more species we got on average. So native seeds can be used to increase diversity, but how we conduct the restoration, how we disturb the system in order to get a seed bed ready for native seeds that have been brought in to establish really can change the trajectory of a plant community. And another example of this was a project we worked on a few years ago in Western Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia along a gradient, and at 10 different locations. And some of the overall results were that when we burned, in this case, these were upland prairies, and when we burned, we did see a substantial increase in species diversity. But that was definitely enhanced by adding seeds. So seeding definitely bumped the species diversity. And we tried a bunch of different techniques as well. And then several years later, we went back to these sites and looked at the species richness in response to these treatments. And what we found was that over time, the different kinds of treatments we had conducted, like burning or herbicide application or mowing, et cetera, had faded. Their impacts had faded and the communities had largely converged, with one exception, that those plots that had been seeded still had higher species diversity than plots that were not seeded. So of all of the things we did, seeding had the long-lasting effect, the longest lasting effect on the community, which suggests that even without treatments, seeding can have significant improvements in plant diversity overall. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk more about some of the emerging issues in native plant selection. So hopefully I've convinced you even more how important it is to plan for diversity in restorations. In this particular example, we're looking at the importance of local adaptation. So this influences where we get our seeds for restoration. And if species are locally adapted, meaning that their fitness is higher close to where they were originally collected, if you put them in the ground close to where they came from, they do better, then we need to keep that in mind when we're selecting seeds for habitat restoration. So in this study, which examined 305 papers on local adaptation, doing common gardens and that kind of thing, we found that there were 3 different kinds of signatures of local adaptation. The first was among population variation. For there to be local adaptation, there has to be differences between populations in how well they perform at a given location when they're all grown together. And we found that by far the majority, 95% of studies reported variation among populations. So there's a lot of between population variation out there in the world. The second signature was the trait by environment variation. In other words, that the characteristics of plants were genetically correlated to rainfall or temperature or something about their physical habitat. And we found that 86% out of 161 studies reported trait by environment variation. So that's a strong signal for local adaptation. And then out of a smaller subset of studies that performed their experiments in the way we could examine this, we found that 67 to 90% of 24 and 10 studies found local advantage for survival and flowering of plants. So all of these signatures taken together suggest that local adaptation is absolutely the norm. This is focused on the Great Basin in Western North America, but the implications are solid, I think, for any ecosystem. So, and one of the upshots is that non-local types of plants may fail in restorations. So if we just go with the cheapest seed source that's from 2 states away, even though it's the right species, it may not be the right genotype, and it is likely to fail. And so that would be a waste of our coin. So one approach to this is to develop seed zones. So provisional seed zones for the United States have been developed, and the idea for these is that if you've got a species in one of these seed zones that you want to use in restoration, you should be able to use that species from anywhere in that seed zone at your restoration site if it's in that seed zone, and expect those plants to do well. Now, really, this is a hypothesis. This map is suggesting that in lieu of better data, you could use something like this that's based on ecoregions and climate information. Those factors that are the main drivers of local adaptation. Makes sense. If you've got better data, you should use better data. But this is something that allows you to move forward, even if you don't have common garden studies on every species you're working with. If you're planning for climate change, then I think it's important to be aware that the effects of climate change have not been the same so far, or not anticipated to be the same in the future across the continent. In this study by Havens et al., they found that plants in Eastern North America are largely going to be pushed north during climate change. However, in the Western US, they could be pushed in any direction, in part because of the far greater topographic variation in the West, that mountain ranges force species uphill, and uphill might actually be south. And so it's not just safe to move plants north across the country. We need to think about the topography we're working within as well, and things could get quite complicated. Other strategies for dealing with this kind of situation suggested by Breed and others is that you can either have a strictly local selection of seeds. So you, like, for example, if you're doing a restoration, you only use seeds from plants that already occur at the same site or next door. You could have a relaxed or mixed local, a composite mix where you're going to many different populations across the species range. Admixture, where, yeah, that's the range-wide one. And then a predictive, which is where you actually try to take your seeds from an area that is predicted to match the climate at your current site in the future. So these are all sort of a range of options one can take. In this study here, I wanted to point out that if you want to use a mixture of seeds from multiple populations, it's important to know that that actually results in higher genetic diversity. And in this example, which is one of the very few that has traced seeds from the wild source through a nursery and into a restoration, we found that that's exactly what does happen. When we take seeds from a wild source, and from several wild sources, in this case, 4 different wild sources, each with a unique genetic signature, combine them in a nursery, they retain their differences in the nursery, but the nursery becomes an amalgam of all of these. And then when we mix all these together and put them out on a restoration site, the resulting reintroduced populations have much higher genetic diversity and are an accurate amalgam of the populations they represented in the nursery. So it's actually very possible to make an admixture of populations for restoration and see that genetic diversity enhancement carry forward all the way into the restoration site. Now, one of the upsides is you get higher genetic diversity, you get improvements in adaptation and resilience in the long term. That's hypothetical, but we believe that'll be the case. Lowered inbreeding, that occurred in this study, and reduced pressure on any one wild population for seed collection. The downside is the potential for outbreeding depression. However, this has not been reported for plants from locally mixed seed sources. So if the seed sources aren't taken from too far apart, we don't expect any danger of outbreeding depression, at least in general. So there's also the issue of the importance of context for seed source selection. You know, if you're doing a restoration in a wildland where there are no, you're not in an urban area, but you're enhancing wild conditions, and there are other wild populations of the same species in the neighborhood, that's a different context than, for example, a garden in an urban center where there are a few wild populations of the same species around, and the ecosystem functions that you expect or desire to achieve may be different. In this study, we looked at the urban garden, small scale, versus the wildland restoration, large scale contexts. And we examined the suitability for ecosystem function of different seed sources. And the source material types that we were able to locate included high genetic diversity from known sources, and those were optimal for all contexts. They might not be as beautiful as some selections in the garden, but they would achieve many of the goals that everybody had in any kind of context. As genetic diversity and source identity decline, so for example, you get into nativars and selections, so does the suitability for wildland restoration. So using plant selections and nativars for wildland restoration is not recommended. Those are better in a garden context. And then many types remain suitable for gardens, even kind of oddball things. But if you want your garden to support pollinators, to support butterfly larvae and other organisms like that, backing away from strong selections or odd crosses and staying in nativars and back into just wild types is a much safer bet. So here we go into the next poll question, and I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Yeah, I'll just launch this poll so that everybody can participate. So there's the poll available, and the question is, how do you most often obtain seeds for restoration? And the options are purchased from commercial vendor, produced on contract with a grower, wild collected with going, I think it's without going through agricultural production, through a regional native seed production partnership, or I have not or do not obtain seeds yet. And we are looking at some interesting results here as answers continue to come in. So I'll just give you a few more seconds, attendees, so that you can participate in this poll before we close it down. So please go ahead and choose the answer that most applies to you. All right, I'm going to end the poll here and share the results.
All right, thanks, Sarah. And that was a more nuanced kind of question and perhaps a little more difficult to absorb on the fly. But the idea is just to find out where people tend to get their seeds from most across the population of listeners here. And the majority are purchased from commercial vendors, but second behind that is I have not obtained seeds yet, or I don't do that. So there's a lot of people who don't do that. Wild collected without going through, it should have said without, going through an agricultural production was third, and through a regional native seed production partnership was fourth, and produced on contract with a grower was fifth. But really this is fairly flat. There's a lot of approaches out there and a lot of people doing different things. This is really interesting to hear about, and I appreciate this feedback. So I'm going to resume here. And let's see, I want to make sure that you can see the slides change. Okay, great. So now I'm going to talk about some online seed selection tools that are out there. And there's 5 examples for us to work through. One is the Native Seed Network, which is managed by the Institute for Applied Ecology. And really, this is a way for you to find seed sources for the species you're interested in locating from a commercial vendor. So this is a database that links the seed types or the species with the vendors, so you can find vendors that you're looking for. It's a directory of native plant nurseries and producers. It has an easy user interface. This is the part of our organization that also hosts the National Native Seed Conference every few years. We were planning to host one early next year. However, we may switch to a virtual platform for this because of the pandemic and COVID-19. So the next one is the Ecoregional Revegetation Application, or ERA. The web link is at the top there. This has been produced by the U.S. Federal Highway Administration and is based on the U.S. EPA Level 3 ecoregions and the USDA plants database. So this is a species selection tool, not a source selection tool. This generates a list of species by ecoregion, and it has a filter that focuses on workhorse plants, restoration plants, and pollinator plants. And of course, as you work up towards workhorse plants, they have a wider usage and generally availability. So this is really just like a for a particular area, but you get to specify the area, and the website makes a list for you. New and online tools for seed selection. Again, the TRM Seed Zone Mapper. So this is put together by the Forest Service largely, and it's available for desktop and mobile apps. So that can be quite handy if you're out in the field. It visualizes various seed zone layers, including the provisional seed zones that I talked about earlier, the ecoregions at level 3, the plant seed zone, Great Basin zones for grasses and forbs that have been developed, and some empirical seed zones for various species that have been examined in detail. So what you do is you upload your points of where you're going to do your restoration, and it tells you the kind of the spatial extent from which you could select populations of these species. So this is useful for not necessarily selecting the species, but for the source of those species. The next tool is called the Seed Selector, and it's available at Seed Mapper. This is a product of the Colorado Native Plant Program, the US BLM, and the USGS. And this allows you to include climate in the conversation when you're looking at what source to choose for your species of interest. So it matches the climate of the seed accession to planting locations. So it assumes a single location of provenance for each seed source. So if you've got something that was produced in a mixed manner, this might be a little more difficult to use. And the user uploads the seed accession information, like the latitude and longitude of each of the populations of a species that are of interest in a spreadsheet. And then you can batch process these for up to 50 points at a time. There is a video tutorial that shows you how to use this as well. So this is a very nice tool if you have seeds, but you want to know where they're best applicable on the landscape. And then the last one here is called the Climate Smart Seed Lot Selection Tool. This is a really powerful tool that's been developed by the Forest Service and the Conservation Biology Institute, another nonprofit here in Corvallis, Oregon. It identifies the locations where seeds may be moved to a new site to match the climate. The user must specify both the past and the future climate scenario either the past or future climate scenario, and it requires user familiarity with climate variables. So there's a whole bunch of climate variables that you can use to say, these are the ones I'm curious about, where the climate is going to move for this accession or for my restoration site in the future. But you have to make some decisions about what climate variables you want to base that on. And so that is somewhat of a hurdle, but with some research on this site, you can get over that. This was primarily developed for trees, but there's really no reason it can't work for herbaceous species or other species as well. So the summary of the online tools that we just looked at were the Native Seed Network, the TRM Seed Zone Mapper, the Eco-Regional Revegetation Application Tool, the Seed Selector, and the Climate Smart Seed Lot Selection Tool. Those are all 5 different tools online, and they're really quite supportive of one another. It's not like pick one or the other. They all do different things, and they can all be very helpful for you. So that concludes my presentation. We do have one polling question left in a minute, but we can open this up to questions. The polling question has to do with the fact that we're planning to release a survey of plant selection perspectives of practitioners and how their restorations are responding to climate change. This is actually a repeat of a survey that was conducted 10 years ago. And if you'd like to participate in that new survey, which is adjusted and sort of updated from 10 years ago, we'd love to hear from you and gather your email address and include you in that survey. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to launch the poll, and then we can go into questions.
So the poll is up, and again, the question is, would you be willing to participate in a future online survey on using plant materials in habitat restoration? And Tom, I've got good news for you. It looks like most people are happy to participate. So we appreciate that, all of you attendees who are willing to respond to a survey. I'm going to end the poll here because the results are pretty telling there, Tom.
Okay, you can. That's great. Thanks very much, all of you who opted in, that you're interested. And your emails were automatically gathered through that, so you don't have to worry about getting a hold of me and letting me know. So at this point, we'll turn it over to questions. So Sarah, will you lead that, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom, for that presentation. It was a great overview of seed selection and some of the issues that we need to be keeping in mind when we're looking at restoration using seeds. We have had a fairly active chat box during the presentation, so I'll start with some of the questions that have already come in, but attendees, please do continue to enter your questions in the chat box. We'll get to as many as we can here. So one of the first questions that came in was the experiments that you referenced, Tom, the Tillman experiment and the one from Germany, Scherber et al. From 2010. It looks like these experiments were done in more graminoid, herbaceous, maybe grassland systems. And so one of the question is, how transferable are those results and patterns to other ecosystems like forest systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, those experiments were done in grasslands, prairies that were largely grass and forb-dominated systems and not woody vegetation. I think in general, the results are likely to be highly transferable. However, when you have trees on a landscape, it really will depend on the density of those trees. So if it's a closed canopy forest, things could be a little different because trees don't just take light from plants on the ground, they're taking water underground as well. So the diversity of trees may become quite important in those systems for how other parts of the ecosystem responds. So you want to look beyond just the ground layer in a ecosystem with multiple layers.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Another question that came up earlier was during your discussion of amalgamations of seeds from different sources, There's concern about the loss of local native seed adaptations that might be advantageous in the future. And I think this might have to do with a term of art that came up, outbreeding depression.
So what's the question?
So the question is, if we're using these mixes of seeds from different sources
Yes.
in restoration, do we risk a loss of local native seed adaptations that might be advantageous at some point in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I I think anytime you use plant materials that are from a distance, really an ecological distance from where they're going in the ground, you may lose some of the local adaptation and their ability to perform well in the near term. What you really gain also, though, from a mix of populations in your restoration seed is high genetic variability, and therefore greater capacity to respond to a changing environment. So if climate is changing, or if that site is a little different, there should be some genetic type in that seed mix that will do well there. It's a bet hedging strategy.
Okay, great, good to know. And then there are a couple questions about sourcing seeds, especially looking to source seeds from appropriate nearby ecosystems, dealing with provisional seed zones. And specifically, there's a question about, this is more of a practical question, are there any cross-border initiatives for seed zone selection or seed availability forecasting in the works or already available among those resources that you shared with us? This is a question coming out of Canada, Ontario, Canada.
So could you repeat the question part? Are there any new resources coming that are looking more at individual species?
Well, I think the question is more around cross-border initiatives. So,
oh, cross-border. Sorry, I missed that.
Sure.
I simply don't know, so I don't want to say, but I suspect that many of the tools that are being developed could easily be expanded across border as data layers and data structures become more available.
Great, that's good news. Circling back to the bigger diversity stability studies that you cited earlier in your presentation, have there been any similar studies in forest systems that you are aware of?
I haven't looked into that in as much detail. Certainly, though, there has been a lot of work to look at forest systems, and one of the early studies I showed in my talk really was in a forested system in the Siskiyou Mountains, and that one was looking at the effects of time, really, and climate change in that intervening 57 years that showed massive changes in plant diversity in a forest environment. I think these principles are largely transferable from ecosystem to ecosystem, whether it's upland or wetland, forest or grassland. I think tropical or temperate, we'll see the same kinds of signals, perhaps in some different ways or from different interactions with land use, but I think they'll be fairly consistent.
Here's another question related to seed zones and selecting seeds from appropriate sources. And the question is, how are you defining measuring ecological distance for the purposes of mixing populations? So I think you touched on some of this, Tom, but if you could just extrapolate a little bit more on how how ecological distance is measured.
Yeah, you can measure ecological distance in a few different ways. It could just be, if you think temperature, annual temperature is the most important thing, it could be how different in temperature are two sites from one another, two sources, two populations. That would be an environmental difference or an ecological difference. Another approach is to look at many different physical and kind of climate variables, soil variables all at once at an ordination approach, and have, distill those down to one variable and use that new variable as a way to measure environmental distance. There are other methods too that are more formal, where we could be looking at the distance in ordination space between 2 points that were populations, et cetera. But really, it's just a matter of how different are they physically on the landscape, and choosing whatever method you want to use to approach that.
Great. So we have a couple of questions that deal more with highly disturbed sites. One participant points out that urban reclamation should follow the same approach towards ecological connectivity. And then another attendee was asking whether you have any suggestions for restoration of areas that have large soil seed banks of invasive species. And this gets to the question that you addressed briefly of pre-restoration preceding treatments.
Do you want me to do both of those, or was one just a comment?
You could sure address both of them.
Well, certainly urban landscapes are very important as sources of places for nature, especially as urban environments become more dominant on the landscape. They may become the only place for nature for miles around. And their importance isn't just for the organisms that occur in those areas, but for people as well. I guess we're those organisms too. They have strong impacts potentially on our health, both our mental health and our physical health. So I don't mean to diminish the importance of urban landscapes when I say that how you select the plants may be different in those contexts, but instead what you're trying to achieve in those areas and what the risks to wildlands might be, depending on what you select, differ. Now, the next question was about what do you do about a seed bank that's full of weeds? What are some techniques for dealing with that? And restorationists certainly have to grapple with this all the time. One technique is to till the ground and let it resprout and till it again and try to exhaust the seed bank. Sometimes it seems like there's an unlimited supply of seeds in those soils and it's hard to ever exhaust them. So another extreme is to disturb the soil as little as possible and reseed with natives through something like a no-till drill that does very little soil disturbance but places the native seeds out there. Sometimes combining a no-till drill with a chemical fallow treatment, if you're able to use herbicides, you can spray out the weeds multiple times without disturbing the soil and then use a no-till drill. Those are all things that work in grassland prairie ecosystems, but really it will really depend on the system you're working in and the kinds of weeds that are in the seed bank, et cetera. So turn to your restoration professional for help.
Sounds like good advice. Another question, at what point is it appropriate and how much time should elapse to collect seeds from restored areas where native plantings were added into the area from wild seed plantings? So this would be sort of an F2 generation of native restoration.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I honestly don't really know the answer to that. One thing I do know from my experience, or one thing I've experienced that is true sometimes locally, is that when we restore a prairie, the first few years look very different than the next few years. In other words, there are some species that come in strong and fast and fade out quickly, and they're turning over the site to the perennials. And so they may come on strong with annuals or short-lived species, and those fade out. So those annuals are creating an opportunity to collect those annual plant seeds at those sites, I think, because they're going to drop out anyway from the site. And then the perennials, I would wait till they're very well established. And if they're long-lived species, then harvest should be possible. But I think it wouldn't be any different than harvesting from a wild population, that you need to take into account the frequency with which you harvest, the degree, the intensity with which you harvest, and how that differs from species to species, depending on their life history, et cetera. And there's been some work on that to look at sort of harvest rates on different species and how we should balance the intensity and the timing of those. And more work is happening already. The Center for Plant Conservation has a group looking into some additional research on that. So I think there'll be more information coming.
So just following up on that, there was a question earlier about your experience creating a seed bank using quote unquote weedy native early successional annuals and biennials for restoration, and in particular, how you balance the diversity of early successional species with later successional, more quote unquote climax species.
Yeah, I think it's generally a good idea to use both so that at first you have something that's tying the site to outcompete invasives. Sometimes the concern is you're outcompeting your longer lived perennials as well, but often we're finding that's not what happens in our restorations, that the perennials we've seeded just start slow and then take over after the annuals have peaked. I'm sure there's a lot of nuance to that, and it will depend on the site and the biome you're working in. So I don't want to extrapolate too broadly, but I think you have to have a longer view than just the first year and be willing to wait and watch and see what's happening and get into year 3 or 4. But while you're waiting and watching, if there are explosions of weeds, that's your opportunity to nip them in the buds, so to speak, literally, and get them out of the system as soon as you can.
So management doesn't stop with just seeding native plants.
No, especially when it comes to prairies and grasslands, management never stops, period. They're generally a disturbance landscape and must continue in a disturbance regime, usually with fire or animal herbivory or something like that.
Great. Well, let's do one more question here. This is a kind of fascinating one. Should we pay attention to regional rarities like state endangered statuses when selecting seed mixes for restoration projects?
That's a really great question and very close to my heart. That's a part of what I do, is reintroduce endangered or listed or even just rarities into the landscape during restoration. So I think the answer is yes, but it's a very qualified yes. We have to be more careful with species like that than we would with our general workhorse restoration species. These restorations create a tremendous opportunity to establish new, very large populations of some of these rare species and help them get back from the edge of extinction in a rapid manner. So I think we need to examine those opportunities when they arise. And so in our organization, we do work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies on listed species, and we put those plants into seed production and we create large quantities of their seeds, but in a very genetically managed manner so that we're using local seeds for local restorations. And we have successfully established very large and numerous populations of some of these listed species. And this work has contributed to efforts to delist or downlist these species. So yes, I think we should, but with great care, and you should involve the right professionals in that decision in that process.
Great. Thank you for that advice, Tom, and thank you for your talk today. Thank you everyone who attended, and thanks again to our underwriters at the Bureau of Land Management. We're really glad that you all were able to join us today and that Tom was able to share this great guidance on selecting native plants for restoration. So thank you everyone. We will post the video of this webinar by the end of the week, and we will share the links that Tom sent for resources for sourcing seeds. So thank you all and have a good day.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.